This is Dr. Jerome Corsi, and I'm thrilled today to have Douglas Horne with us. I've admired Douglas Horne's work for very many years, and we're going to do 2 hours today on a subject which is very central to thetruthcentral.com. And I encourage everyone to store this, listen to it. Doug is going to tell us the story of how World War II really started, what Pearl Harbor is really about. Let me give you some background on Doug. Doug graduated from Ohio State University in 1974 with a BA in history. He served as an officer in the Navy for 10 years, followed by 10 more years in the Navy as a civil servant in an anti-submarine warfare program. He really came on the map for me when he was on the staff of the Assassinations Record Review Board, which was established after Oliver Stone's movie with the legislation in Congress to try to get declassified a large bulk of the still classified documents on the Kennedy assassination. And Doug worked for 3 of the review boards 4 years, from August 1995 through September 1998. He was a senior analyst on the military records team, and he was promoted to the position of chief analyst for military records. Doug also played a pivotal role in various investigations, the medical records, which I think are just excellent. A thorough examination of the autopsy records at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Doug also did the military records in Cuba and Vietnam. I really recommend you get his. You've got anyone interested in assassination, this is an indispensable work. It's indispensable. And it was groundbreaking in his interviewing of people and probing in all the deceit and lies that went into the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. And I'm working on that right now. Doug also has done enormous work on Pearl Harbor. He has 2 volumes here on Pearl Harbor, which are called Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War, which is a chronology of significant events detailing President Franklin D. Roosevelt's successful effort to bring a united America into the war against Germany during the Second World War. It's a very important story, and it's another part of history that's been suppressed. And what we're going to talk about today, Doug has a volume here. Part of it reads like a novel. I think it could be made into a movie. I mean, it's almost like a movie script. It's the McCollum Memorandum, story of Washington, D.C. in 1940 to 1941, Franklin Roosevelt's journey from deterrence to provocation on the road to Pearl Harbor. It's another untold story. And again, Doug has done seminal work on this. He follows up a book which I've also greatly admired, which is by Robert Stinnett, called Day of Deceit. Robert Stinnett was in World War II. He was on I believe one of the aircraft carriers that George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, served on as a pilot. And after World War II, he was in California as a newspaper photographer, but he got very deeply interested in how Franklin Roosevelt architected Pearl Harbor in order to get the United States into World War II. And this is, I think, a seminal story when we're evaluating just the extent to which the government of the United States and governments in general lie to the public, deceive the public. And I think this is something that the Truth Central, I'm committed to exposing the lies. And I know no one better to do that than Doug Horne. Doug, have admired your career, and I'm honored to have you with us today. So thank you for joining us.
Dr. Corsi, thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk today for about 2 hours about this subject, which I'm so interested in and which, as you said, is so important. So the book, the McCollum Memorandum, begins in October of 1940. And so what I would like to do here is provide the audience with just a little bit of background about what happened before the book begins. So, as everyone will recall, on September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and that kicked off what eventually became World War II. In May of 1940, things accelerated quite a bit when Nazi Germany invaded France and the Netherlands and Belgium on the same day, on May the 10th, 1940. And within the following month, Holland and Belgium were defeated and surrendered, and the British Army was defeated, kicked off the continent of Europe. They all barely escaped it, the Dunkirk evacuation, and the French collapsed. French army did not fight well, and it collapsed. So the response to these events by President Roosevelt in the United States was that in May of 1940, he requested and got the Congress to agree to increase our defense spending by 500%. Can you imagine that happening today? That was quite an increase, 500% increase voted by Congress in May of 1940 in response to Roosevelt's request. Because once Nazi Germany invaded Western Europe and was slicing through it like a hot knife through butter, the panic was on. So then in July of 1940, Roosevelt persuaded the Congress to pass the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which was going to dramatically increase the size of the United States Navy to become by far the largest Navy in the world, one that could fight the defensive in one ocean and fight on the offensive in the other ocean, if necessary. So that's most of the background before this book begins. And the final thing I would mention is that because America at this time was an isolationist nation, which was, disillusioned and disenchanted with the World War I experience, Roosevelt, all he could do is provide some moral support for Great Britain, but he certainly couldn't commit the United States to any military action. So what he started to do during the summer of 1940 was an attempt to persuade the public, he and his cabinet members, to provide all aid short of war to Great Britain so that she wouldn't go down under the Nazi onslaught. And a large part of that effort was what we now call the Destroyers Bases deal. So on September 3rd, 1940, Roosevelt announced something he had been working on for months, which was to give Britain 50 old American destroyers, World War I vintage destroyers that were in mothballs, give them 50 destroyers in exchange for property rights on 8 British bases in the Western Hemisphere. So this was a very ticklish thing to accomplish without going to Congress, but he pulled it off. And that was announced on September the 3rd, 1940. So the final event that occurs that I want to tell you about before this book begins was the Tripartite Pact. Now, I don't want anybody's eyes to glaze over here because we got a lot to talk about, but the Tripartite Pact, which was signed between Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan on September 27th, 1940, was basically a defensive alliance against the United States. So these three nations, which Roosevelt had come to refer to in private as the bandit nations, they announced that there was a new world order and that the world had to recognize the new world order in Europe under Germany and Italy, and had to recognize the new world order which was being put in place in the Far East under Japan. And furthermore, the pact stated that if the United States was to attack any one of those three countries, that all of them would go to war against America. So it was an attempt to warn off the United States. They knew where our sympathies were, the whole world did, and to warn us off and try to prevent us from attacking any one of them. So this is the background for where the McCollum Memorandum begins, which is in October 1940. Now, one more bit of background. In the same month that Hitler invaded France and the Netherlands and Belgium, Roosevelt decided to change the home port of the U.S. fleet from San Diego and San Pedro on the West Coast to change the home port to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, moving it westward by about 5,000 miles. What he did was, at the end of an annual fleet exercise, he told the fleet to stay in Hawaiian waters and to go to Pearl Harbor instead of coming back to the West Coast. And this was very much opposed by the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, Admiral Richardson, who didn't like that at all. He knew that the repair facilities and the training facilities in Pearl Harbor were inferior to those on the West Coast of the U.S., and he also felt that that would put the fleet in kind of an exposed forward deployed position, and he didn't like that either. So at his request, he flew all the way to Washington, D.C. in July of 1940 to argue with President Roosevelt against keeping the fleet at Pearl Harbor. And they had frank discussions, and Roosevelt told him, no, that's the way it's going to be. He said, I've done this as an act of deterrence to keep Japan from any mischief in the Pacific. And if our fleet remains forward deployed at Pearl Harbor, perhaps they'll think twice about making any aggressive moves on the British Empire or the Dutch East Indies. So Richardson lost that argument. So I'm going to tell you in a very brief synopsis what I'm going to discuss for the next hour and 45 minutes. And then we'll go through the details. So what I'm going to talk about is what Roosevelt's primary goal was from October of 1940 through the time of the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. So his primary goal was clearly, undeniably, to get into the war as a belligerent and to fight Nazi Germany. That was what he was interested in doing. There's no doubt about it. No mainstream historian can deny that. All you have to do is read his speeches, one after the other, and beginning in December of 1940 through the end of October in 1941, and you'll see that that's the case. So there are two key events I'm going to be talking about today that serve as a Rosetta Stone, if you will, a Rosetta Stone to understanding how Pearl Harbor came about, the Pearl Harbor attack. So the first Rosetta Stone that I'll be talking about will be the Argentia Conference between Roosevelt and Churchill, which was held at sea on the battleship HMS Prince of Wales off the coast of Newfoundland at a new base we were building called Argentia. And that was one of the 8 bases that we got in exchange for the 50 destroyers. So they held a conference at sea in August of 1941. We'll be talking about that in great detail in a moment, because secret agreements were made there, which the public knew nothing about and didn't know about until years later. The second Rosetta Stone that I want to talk about is a code-breaking decrypted message that the German ambassador in Berlin sent to Tokyo in August of 1941. Now, this is the same month that the conference is taking place between Roosevelt and Churchill off of Newfoundland. So this decrypted message it's a message that was sent from Baranoshima in Berlin to Tokyo on August 15th, 1941, in which Hitler declared his intentions vis-a-vis war with the United States. And we'll get into the details of that in a moment, and you'll see that those are the pillars of the story in my book. Now, so let's get to the title. Let's get to the title of the book, the McCollum Memorandum, and ask who was Arthur McCollum and what was the memorandum that he wrote, and why did Robert Stinnett focus on it so much in his book, Day of Deceit in the year 2000. And why am I making it the title of my book? Well, Arthur McCollum was a naval intelligence officer who was born in Japan of missionary parents in 1898. Grew up in Japan as a child, spoke the language well. He served 2 tours of duty in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s. And as 1940 approaches, he's back in the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C., and he's in charge of the Far East Desk at ONI, the Far East Desk. And what's happening is, the reason he wrote a memo is that Admiral Richardson in Pearl Harbor, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, who doesn't think the fleet should be home-ported in Pearl Harbor, he's coming back to Washington again to discuss again with President Roosevelt whether the fleet should be at Pearl Harbor or whether it should retreat to the West Coast where it's safer. And so on the day before that visit, I don't believe in coincidences, and especially not in this kind of coincidence. On the day before that visit, McCollum writes a policy memo to the head of the Office of Naval Intelligence on October 7th. Now, that person, Rear Admiral Anderson, was a confidant of FDR's. He was one of the naval officers that Roosevelt would meet with regularly over cocktails in the afternoon at the White House. So I'm going to do a little dramatic reading here of just 3 or 4 of the major points in this memo. And I think forgive me, I'm pulling out the book. Once I do this reading, you'll understand why we're talking about this memo. Now, the title of this memo was Estimate of the Situation in the Pacific and Recommendations for Action by the United States. So that's the title of McCollum's memorandum. Essentially, what it said was, we don't want Japan to run wild in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, because if they do, it may bring down the British Empire. It may be the final knife in the back that destroys the British Empire, and we don't want the British Empire to lose this European war with Hitler. So we have to stop Japan, and the earlier we do it, the better. So he was afraid of Japan running wild in the Pacific, overrunning British colonies, overrunning India, taking over the Indian Ocean, and possibly meeting German and Italian armies at the Suez Canal. That's what he was afraid of. So that's why he wrote his memo. His memo is a reaction to the Tripartite Pact. So what is the United States going to do about this alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan? So in paragraph 8 of his memo, he says the following: a consideration of the foregoing leads to the conclusion that prompt, aggressive naval action against Japan by the United States would render Japan incapable of affording any help to Germany and Italy in their attack on England. He then continues in paragraph 9, and get a load of this. This is what he writes in paragraph 9. McCollum writes, quote, "It is not believed that in the present state of political opinion, the United States government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado," unquote. So you see, he was in favor of us going to war with Japan, but he realized that politically we couldn't do that without much more ado. So here are the action steps, the principal action steps that he recommended the U.S. government follow. There were 8 action steps. I'm going to read the 4 biggest ones to you, the 4 biggest ones. Send 2 divisions of submarines to the Orient. Well, we had some submarines in the Asiatic fleet, but we sent more. So that came to pass pretty quickly. At the time that Pearl Harbor was attacked, there were a lot of U.S. submarines. Most of them are older subs, but there were a lot of subs in the Philippines. Here's another recommendation he made. keep the main strength of the U.S. fleet now in the Pacific in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. So he's recommending that Roosevelt keep the fleet at Pearl Harbor. He then says, insist that the Dutch refuse to grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil. Now, this is very important because at this time, Japan got 80 to 90% of its oil from the United States. Most authors say 90%. One recent author says 80%, but it was a large preponderance of its oil was gotten from the United States. And the only other alternate source Japan had was the Dutch East Indies, the Netherlands East Indies. And they didn't want to think about, the Japanese didn't want to think about what would happen if the U.S. cut off their oil. So they were beginning to desire negotiations with the Dutch East Indies for oil deals in case we cut off their oil. Japanese were afraid of that. So the final point in the memo, and listen carefully to this one because this happened also, completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. Cut off all trade with Japan, which would have meant cutting off all the oil too. Well, that did happen. That happened in late July of the next year, 1941. So, in the final paragraph of his main text, this is the bombshell. Listen to what McCollum writes to the head of ONI for further transmission to the president. He writes the following, quote, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war, unquote. I repeat, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better, unquote. And then in his summary, he said, it is to the interest of the U.S. to eliminate Japan's threat in the Pacific at the earliest opportunity by taking prompt and aggressive action against Japan, unquote. So this is the McCollum Memorandum, and this is the beginning, the implementation of all these steps is the beginning of Roosevelt's shift from deterrence to provocation. So the very next day after this memo is written, Roosevelt meets with Richardson again in Washington, with Admiral Richardson. And they clash again over basing the fleet at Pearl Harbor. And once again, Richardson loses the argument. Now, what I want to do is read you the one big quote, the memorable quote from the meeting between Admiral Richardson and President Roosevelt on October the 8th. They're talking about the future, and Richardson has already lost the argument about moving the fleet back to the West Coast. He's already lost that argument, and he knows it. So then he says to Roosevelt, do you think we're going to get into the war? And when Richardson asked the question, he was talking about the European war. Because when he talked to Roosevelt in July, earlier in July, he got the impression that Roosevelt was going to enter the European war if he got reelected, that it was just a matter of getting reelected first. That was the impression Richardson got in July. And by the way, he put all this in his memoirs, which were published in 1958. That's how we know all this. So here it is, October 8th, 1940. And Richardson says, do you think we'll get into the war? And he meant the European war, and that's not how Roosevelt answered him. Roosevelt answered, will we get into war against Japan? Here's what Roosevelt said. Quote, if the Japanese attack Thailand or the Kra Peninsula or the Dutch East Indies, we will not enter the war. Even if Japan attacks the Philippines, I doubt whether we would enter the war, but they cannot always avoid making mistakes. And as the war in the Pacific continues and the area of operations expands, sooner or later, the Japs will make a mistake, commit an overt act, and we would then enter the war, unquote. I repeat, sooner or later, the Japs will make a mistake, commit an overt act, and we would then enter the war, unquote. Well, that pretty much says it all. Roosevelt has read the McCollum Memorandum, and he's thinking about moving from deterrence to provocation in the future. So what happens between this meeting on October 8th and the end of the year? Well, several things. First of all, Roosevelt's running for re-election for a third term. No president has ever done that before. And there's a strong isolationist movement in the United States. About a third of the people and about half the newspapers are isolationists. So it's a significant minority that are isolationist, and they're making a lot of noise. And in fact, the American First Committee was formed on September 1st, 1940, and its primary spokesman was Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, and they were advocating not entering the war in Europe, and that we just have a Fortress America. So Roosevelt made two campaign speeches in October of 1940 in which he promised not to involve the United States in foreign wars. That's what people were worried about. They weren't sure why he was running for office. Was he running for office to keep us out of the war? Or was he running for office to get us into the war? No one was really sure. So I'm going to read you the two big quotes from his campaign speeches in Philadelphia and in Boston. And the first one is from October 23rd in Philadelphia. So here's the quote. Quote, this is FDR. I give to you and to the people of this country the most solemn assurance there is no secret treaty, no secret obligation, no secret commitment, no secret understanding in any shape or form, direct or indirect, with any other government or any other nation in any part of the world to involve this nation in any war or for any other purpose. And here's the punchline. We will not participate in foreign wars, and we will not send our army, naval, or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside the Americas, except in case of attack, unquote. So that was Philadelphia on October 23rd. And then a week later, on October 30th in Boston, FDR made another version of this promise, but he took off the caveat at the end. Here's what he said on October 30th in Boston. While I'm talking to you fathers and mothers, I give you one more assurance. I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars, end quote. Now, one of his speechwriters, Sam Rosenman, had asked him when he reviewed the final draft of the speech why he had dropped the caveat, except in case of attack. And Roosevelt explained to Sam Rosenman, quote, it's not necessary. If we're attacked, it's no longer a foreign war, unquote. So Roosevelt wins re-election. It was not the landslide that he had in 1936. He won 55% to 45% in the popular vote. Excuse me. And Electoral College made it look stronger. It was 38 states for Roosevelt, 10 states for Wendell Willkie. But he won re-election to a third term. What happens is that beginning on September 7th, Great Britain is pummeled by the Blitz, by German indiscriminate bombing of British cities, primarily London, which also included the destruction of Coventry and bombing of other cities. But primarily, the target was London. And it was a terror bombing attack intended to destroy British morale and to get them to come to the negotiating table and cut a deal with Hitler. because he really wasn't that interested in invading England. He didn't have a big navy. He was afraid of the water and afraid of the bad things that could happen if the invasion didn't go well. So he preferred to get the British to knuckle under with a bombing campaign, terror bombing. Meanwhile, Great Britain is ordering a lot of munitions from the United States under the policy called cash and carry. So, once Germany invaded Poland in September 39, Roosevelt got the Congress to amend the Neutrality Act, which allowed foreigners to buy munitions in the United States, but they had to pay cash for them. U.S. banks were not allowed to loan money anymore to belligerents, to other countries at war. U.S. banks were not allowed to do that anymore. So the person buying munitions in America had to pay cash, and they had to carry it away on their own ships or on ships of third nations. U.S. ships couldn't carry war material anymore. So under cash and carry, the British had been ordering and purchasing a lot of munitions in the United States. On December the 9th, while Roosevelt was on a fishing vacation in the Caribbean on board a U.S. Navy cruiser, the Tuscaloosa, he received a very important historical document from Churchill called the Very Long Letter. So the Very Long Letter, which Roosevelt received on December 9th, it was 10 pages, single-spaced, 4,000 words from Churchill to Roosevelt, basically said, thank you for the help you've given us up to now, but he said, we're almost broke. He said, Churchill told Roosevelt, we've already ordered more munitions and airplanes from your country for next year, for delivery next year, than we can pay for. And after that, we won't be able to pay for anything. He said, right now we have more on order than we can pay for next year when they're made. So he basically asked Roosevelt to give him everything he needed and to help get it over to Great Britain. And so Roosevelt struggled with this for several days, trying to decide what to do about it. And what happened next was that starting on December 17th, 1940, with a press conference, through the end of May 1941, with another major speech, Roosevelt proceeded to attempt to persuade the American people to provide all aid short of war to Great Britain and to provide it for free. And the implication always was, and if necessary, we're going to help get it over there. Although he was very reluctant to drop the hammer on that until he had to. But so his campaign of persuasion began on December 17th with a press conference in the Oval Office when he floated the idea of giving Great Britain all the implements of war they needed at no cost. So I'm going to read to you the principal statement he made during that press conference on December 17th. So Roosevelt says to the assembled media in the Oval Office, well, let me give you an illustration. Suppose my neighbor's house catches fire and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. What is the transaction that goes on? I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over, unquote. And of course, so as Roosevelt pointed out, if you help the neighbor put out his fire by loaning him your garden hose, then the fire won't reach over to your house and burn down your house either. So this was the rather simple homily that Roosevelt used to sell what became known as the Lend-Lease program. Now, one of the worst raids on London by the German Air Force was on the night of December 29th and December 30th, 1940. when the Luftwaffe tried to burn down the financial district called the City. And the city included St. Pauls Cathedral, one of the most famous landmarks in Great Britain. So it just so happens, as a coincidence, there are some coincidences in history. Many of the ones that historians say are coincidences are not, but this is a real coincidence. It just so happens that on that night, Roosevelt made his greatest speech of his 4 administrations. It was called the Arsenal of Democracy speech, in which he first sold the idea of Lend-Lease to Great Britain and all other countries fighting Nazi Germany. So I'm just going to read you 3 or 4 sentences from the Arsenal of Democracy speech, the fireside chat of December 29th. And by the way, St. Paul's did not burn down. It was hit by something like 28 incendiaries, and those fires on the roof were put out. People wielding buckets of sand and stirrup pumps, the fire watch. And the rest of the city around St. Paul's, the rest of the financial district did burn down that night. And so at least the next afternoon, the British people were able to read in their newspapers about this great speech that Roosevelt had made. Here's one of the big sentences in the speech. If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun. Roosevelt went on to say, but we well know that we cannot escape danger or the fear of danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. And he went on to say, no man, tiger, into a kitten by stroking it. So this was his push against appeasement and against isolationism. So he went on to say, in a military sense, Great Britain and the British Empire are today the spearhead of resistance to world conquest. And they're putting up a fight which will live forever in the story of human gallantry. There is no demand by Britain, he meant, for sending an American expeditionary force outside of our own borders. There was no intention by any member of your government to send such a force. Well, it turns out that wasn't true, but that's what he was telling the American people. So he winds up the speech by saying, we must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. I believe that the Axis powers are not going to win this war. So that's the Arsenal of Democracy speech. And it was very well received, as you can imagine, by Winston Churchill and by the British people and by the American people. He followed this up on January 6th with the State of the Union address, which basically formalized this proposal that we give the nations fighting Nazi Germany and fascist Italy all material aid they need without making them pay for it. And the key line in that speech was this, quote, we cannot and we will not tell them that they must surrender merely because of present inability to pay for the weapons which we know they must have, end quote. And then he went on to propose the 4 freedoms, which were his moralistic underpinning for this kind of support, namely freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. So those are all nice sounding phrases, but the main part of that speech is that we're not going to tell them that we're not going to tell these countries they should surrender just because they can't pay for what they need. And his whole point of the Arsenal of Democracy speech and the press conference that preceded it were to say that, oh, we're not going to enter the war. This is the best way for us to stay out of the war, is by loaning our fire hose to the neighbor whose house is on fire. And when his fire is out, he'll give us the garden hose back. So the Lend-Lease bill, as it came to be known, was introduced a few days after the State of the Union address in January 1941. And after 2 months of spirited debate, the Lend-Lease bill passed on March 11th, 1941. And in fact, Roosevelt's former opponent, Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate for president in 1940, had come out in support of the Lend-Lease bill. So the thing ended up passing handily after spirited debate for 2 months in Congress. And then immediately the interventionists and hawks on Roosevelt's cabinet, they wanted him to immediately begin to convoy these goods from the United States all the way to England. And Roosevelt wasn't ready to do that because the isolationists would have raised hell, and they would have said, no, you said you're going to keep us out of war by giving material aid to Great Britain. If you start using the U.S. Navy to convoy the ships over there, that's going to get us involved in the war. So he wasn't ready to do that by any means. So he held off on that, even though most of his advisors insisted on doing it immediately. Now, at the end of May 27th, 1941, Roosevelt made another speech in which he reiterated the need to provide as much aid as possible to Great Britain, and that we ramp up our own defense preparations to defend the United States and defend the Western Hemisphere. And this became known as the Unlimited National Emergency Speech, in which he proclaimed there was an unlimited national emergency. And I'm going to try to read just 2 or 3 sentences from that one, if I can find it here without much ado. So he summarizes as follows. First, we shall actively resist whenever necessary and with all our resources, every attempt by Hitler to extend his Nazi domination to the Western Hemisphere or threaten it. We shall actively resist his every attempt to gain control of the seas. Secondly, from the point of view of strictly military and naval necessity, we shall give every possible assistance to Britain and to all who, with Britain, are resisting Hitlerism or its equivalent with force of arms. Our patrols are helping now to ensure delivery of the needed supplies to Britain. All additional measures necessary to deliver the goods will be taken. So he ends up with the peroration saying that we reassert the ancient American doctrine of freedom of the seas. We've pledged material support to the other democracies of the world, and we will fulfill that pledge. We are placing our armed forces in strategic military position. We will not hesitate to use our armed forces to repel attack. Therefore, I have issued a proclamation that there's an unlimited national emergency. So, most of the people who heard this speech on May 27th thought that Roosevelt was about to begin to convoy British merchant ships from the United States and Canada to England. And the next day, he threw a wet blanket over that and said, no, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. And he backed off from that impression that people had gotten. And so this left everybody confused. That speech electrified everybody. It electrified his opposition and the isolationist movement. They thought he was about to begin to convoy British ships. And it electrified the interventionists like his Secretary of War and Secretary of the Navy, who wanted him to declare war on Germany. And if he wasn't going to do that, they at least wanted him to convoy the goods to England and protect those goods with the U.S. Navy so they wouldn't be sunk by German U-boats. And the next day, he backed off. And we now know why he backed off. Early in January 1941, both Churchill and Roosevelt became aware through intelligence sources that Germany was about to stab its temporary ally, the USSR, in the back. Hitler was about to stab Stalin in the back and invade the Soviet Union sometime in the late spring or early summer. They knew this. The American public didn't know that. So Roosevelt didn't want to start convoying too early. He didn't want to start this too early. He didn't want to do anything that might make Hitler reconsider and not invade the Soviet Union. So he was holding off on that decision until after Hitler had thrown the dice and made his first big mistake of the war and invaded the USSR. So Roosevelt was getting people ready for war and ready for the idea of defending the seas and freedom of the seas and doing what was needed to defend the Western Hemisphere, but he wasn't ready to convoy yet. So before I proceed, what I'd like to do is read to you just a few remarks people have made about the personality of FDR, the man we're talking about here. Understanding his personality and how he operated is essential to understanding this story of how we got in the war. Believe me, you'll understand that as we proceed. So here's my favorite quote of all the quotes about FDR. This is from Walter Lippmann, the national journalist and columnist. Lippmann wrote, quote, "Roosevelt was a wonderful finagler. He loved to take a complicated thing which involved a certain amount of deception, hornswoggling of people, and somehow get it done," unquote. Roosevelt himself said to his Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, he said this early in 1942, right after we entered the war. Roosevelt said the following, quote, "You know, I am a juggler and I never let my right hand know what my left hand is doing. I am perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths if it will help win the war," unquote. Now, Roosevelt said this about himself in 1942, but this describes how he was operating in 1940 and 41. There's no doubt about it. He was a juggler, and he was juggling his instincts that we needed to get into the war with one hand versus how do I handle my isolationism problem in America, the public relations problem, with the other hand, and trying to strike a middle ground until he could do what he had to do and get us into the war. Here's what historian John Meacham said. Quote, "What could make Roosevelt a trying husband and a frustrating friend could make him a great president. Sometimes politicians have to pursue different courses at the same time and deceive those closest to them about what they are doing," end quote. And then James McGregor Burns, one of Roosevelt's biographers, said, "He could be bold or cautious, Machiavellian or moralistic, impetuous or temporizing, urbane or almost rustic." Now, there's a quote attributed to Roosevelt, which you can find on the internet. Quote, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way," unquote. Now, this may be an apocryphal quote. It may be something that he didn't quite say in exactly those words, but it does represent his attitude. And then the final quote I want to read you about the subject we're talking about today was from the hero of the Battle of Midway, the codebreaker Joseph Rochefort of the Navy, the man who broke the Japanese naval code and let us know that they were coming at Midway, where we soundly defeated them in what was a very close-run battle until the miraculous 5 minutes in June of 42. So Joe Rochefort, later in his life, in the year 1970, in his oral history with the Navy Department, said the following: "The attack on Pearl Harbor was a pretty cheap price to pay for unifying the country," end quote. That's not me saying that. That's Joe Rochefort, the hero of the Battle of Midway. Okay, So, in June of 1941, June 21st, to be precise, Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, finally did what Roosevelt and Churchill knew he was planning, and he invaded the Soviet Union. Now, these two totalitarian regimes really hated each other, and they had made a temporary peace pact, a non-aggression pact, in August of 1939, and agreed not to go to war with each other, and they had agreed secretly to divide up Poland, so that 2 weeks after Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 2 weeks later, Stalin invaded the other half of Poland, and they cut it in half. And then for the next several months, Stalin proceeded to send Hitler blackmail payments, shipments of oil and lumber and food every month to keep Germany from attacking the USSR. So this all came to an end in June 1941. Hitler decided to invade the USSR and get rid of his principal enemy once and for all. And his thinking was, once I do that, I'll take care of Great Britain later. Britain hasn't succumbed to the air campaign. They haven't cut a deal with us. So we'll take care of them later. But first I have to destroy my main enemy, Joseph Stalin and the communist USSR, because Hitler wanted the breadbasket of Western Russia and the Ukraine. He wanted Lebensraum, living room, all that rich farmland. And he also wanted to engage in a murderous war of annihilation, a war of murder, and kill all the Slavs that he could and all the Jews that he could in Russia. So that's what that was all about. Now, once that happened, everything changed as far as Roosevelt was concerned. And while it was very important not to let Great Britain go down, Roosevelt knew after June 21st that Great Britain was no longer under threat of invasion, at least not during the year 1941. Hitler was now preoccupied with the USSR. And Roosevelt's preoccupation became not letting the USSR collapse and not letting them be defeated by Nazi Germany. And this will affect what he did late in July, which we'll get to in a minute. So during the summer, Roosevelt sent Harry Hopkins, his number one aide, over to visit Joseph Stalin. Hopkins had visited Churchill earlier that year, so he went over to Great Britain a second time, and then he went over to visit Joseph Stalin for the first time to try to assess whether they would stay in the war and keep fighting, and what they would need from us to keep fighting Hitler. Because Roosevelt knew that, hey, these two gigantic armies, 3 million German troops and equal numbers of Soviet troops, if not more, were fighting each other. And this was where the war was really going to be decided for the most part, the European war. It's going to be decided on Germany's Eastern Front with the USSR. So Hopkins reported back to FDR later that Stalin acknowledged to him that Great Britain and the USSR fighting alone could not defeat Nazi Germany, that they needed the help of the United States, and they needed the United States to actually enter the war as a combatant to defeat Hitler. Stalin acknowledged that. And so this was on Roosevelt's mind that summer. Now, before we proceed with the two Rosetta Stones that I mentioned earlier, the Argentia Conference with Churchill in August 41 and the decrypted diplomatic message, I want to talk about Roosevelt's shift again from deterrence to provocation. Now, Roosevelt had a meeting on February 10th, 1941 with the head of the Navy, Admiral Stark, and some of his other cabinet members. And he said, I want you to conduct pop-up cruises using the U.S. Navy where they just pop up out of nowhere and appear very close to Japanese territorial waters all over the Pacific just to keep the Japs off balance. And by the way, that's how people talked in those days. It was the Japs, okay? They didn't say Japanese, and this includes Roosevelt. So Admiral Stark didn't like this idea at all. He was afraid that it would lead to war with Japan. So he wrote about this in one of the many letters that Stark wrote to his friends, and that's how this was recorded for history. So Roosevelt said during the meeting, "I think I shall call them pop-up cruises. I just want them to keep popping up here and there and keep the Japs guessing." Now listen to this. Roosevelt said, "I don't mind losing 1 or 2 cruisers, but do not take the chance on losing 5 or 6, end quote. Really? I don't mind losing 1 or 2 cruisers, but don't take a chance on losing 5 or 6? That is a very revealing state of mind for FDR. So Stark told the president, he said, "Mr. President, if we carry out cruises of this nature, it will precipitate hostilities." Roosevelt said, "Do it anyway." As it turned out, there were 3 pop-up cruises. One was in March of 1941, and the other 2 were in July and August of 1941. And in fact, on the night of July 31st, one pop-up cruise came very close to the entrance to the Bungo Strait. The Bungo Strait was the most sensitively guarded entrance to Japan's inland sea. Most of its fleet was home ported in the inland sea, and the southern channel leading into the inland sea was the Bungo Strait. And here's the diplomatic protest the Japanese filed on July 31st. Listen to this. Quote, "On the night of July 31st, 1941, Japanese fleet units at anchor in Tsukumo Bay in the Bungo Strait picked up the sound of propellers approaching Bungo Channel from eastward. Duty destroyers of the Japanese Navy investigated and sighted 2 darkened cruisers that disappeared in a southerly direction behind a smokescreen. When they were challenged, Japanese naval officers believed the vessels were United States cruisers," end quote. Well, they were. So remember, back on October 8th, 1940, Roosevelt had told Admiral Richardson, quote, "Sooner or later, the Japs will make a mistake and we will then enter the war," end quote. So that didn't happen on July 31st, 1941, but it might have, as the diplomatic protest reveals, as Roosevelt started moving from deterrence to provocation. So Roosevelt became so preoccupied with not allowing the Soviet Union to go down that he took steps to prevent the Japanese from invading Siberia in 1941. So remember, the Japanese were the traditional enemies of Russia ever since the Japanese-Russo War, Japanese-Russian War of 1904 and 1905. Now, Japan won that war, but it was exhausted at the end of it. Exhausted in terms of manpower and material. Officially, the Japanese won, but they were exhausted. And the war ended up with a lot of Japanese troops in Manchuria after 1931, and a lot of Russian troops in Siberia and in Mongolia. So as soon as Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Japanese began to have an internal debate about which way to go. Are we going to go south and take the resources of the South Pacific, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rice of Southeast Asia, the tin and rubber of Southeast Asia, or are we going to go north and attack our traditional enemy, Russia, while they're weakened by the Germans? And there was this debate going on within Japan. And from code breaking, which I'll talk about in a minute, we knew that. So Roosevelt finally took big steps at the end of July 1941 to make sure that the Japanese did not go north and attack the Soviet Union. Roosevelt put a financial freeze on all Japanese assets on July 26, 1941. Right before he went off to meet with Churchill off of Newfoundland, he froze all Japanese funds. Now, he didn't tell the public this, but what this meant was that it was a de facto oil embargo against Japan. So the Japanese had been stockpiling bunker oil, heavy oil for their Navy for 2 years, buying all they could from us. And what he did was, with the funds freeze, was cut off their oil without calling it an oil embargo, but that's really what it was. And by doing so, he ensured that the Japanese would not go north and attack Russia and knock them out of the war with Hitler, but instead they would have to go south. Because the only other place the Japanese could get oil was from the Dutch East Indies, the Netherlands East Indies. And in fact, the Japanese had been negotiating with the Dutch for about a year when the Dutch, at our urging, finally cut them off. So in June of 1941, in early June, the Dutch finally told the Japanese, no deal, we're not going to sell you all this oil you want. We don't trust your future intentions in the Pacific. We're not going to sell you this oil, too bad. And so the Japanese immediately knew that if the Americans ever cut off their oil supply, they were going to have to get it by invading the Dutch East Indies. So something I haven't mentioned yet is the Japanese invaded China in 1937. And by the time we get to 1941, the summer of 41, Japan has been involved in this big war with China for 4 years, and they can't win the war. They've occupied a lot of territory, sacked a lot of cities, including the horrible rape of Nanking in 1937, but they can't win the war and bring it to a termination. And it's destroying the Japanese economy. Most of their people at home don't have enough food to eat, and the war is very expensive for the Japanese, and so they're stuck like a fly to fly paper. And so the Japanese knew, and we knew as well, they could not both attack Russia in the north and go south to get the resources of Southeast Asia at the same time. They only had enough resources to either go north or to go south. So by cutting off Japan's oil in July of 1941, July 26th, Roosevelt ensured that they would not be able to go north and fight this war in Siberia against their traditional enemy, Russia. Japan instead would have to go south and southeast to get the oil of the Dutch East Indies through conquest. And they wouldn't be able to attack Russia. Now, this ended up later saving Stalin's bacon, because in October of 1941, after Hitler's offensive slowed down considerably, Stalin transferred 1.5 million troops from Siberia to defend Moscow. And the reason Moscow didn't fall, one of the reasons, late in 41, was because Stalin had transferred all these troops. Because by this time, Stalin knew that Japanese weren't going to attack him in Siberia. Well, Roosevelt is the one that engineered all that with the oil embargo at the end of July 41. But by embargoing Japanese oil in July 41, Roosevelt did ensure that eventually Japan would attack the Dutch East Indies, and he did ensure that eventually Japan, a very embittered Japan, would go to war with the United States. Now, he didn't know where or when, but he knew that eventually they would go to war against us out of a sense of rage and anger over what he had done. But he did save Stalin's bacon. So let's talk about code breaking, because code breaking is a big part of this story, and it's going to become a big part of the story from now on. So let's talk about the two principal codes that the British and the Americans were breaking that allowed our leaders to have insights into what the enemy was doing as America proceeded toward entering World War II. So one code-breaking effort was called Magic, the breaking of the Japanese high-level diplomatic code by the United States. And to make a long story short, after 18 months of effort, the United States Army's Signal Intelligence Service, the U.S. Army civilian geniuses, really, mathematicians, figured out how to break the new Japanese diplomatic code. They figured out that the Japanese were encoding their diplomatic messages by electronic means, and they figured out a mathematical way to build an analog machine which would copy what their machine was doing and decode those messages. It took a year and a half to do this. And the Army turned its plans for how to build this machine over to the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy ended up building 8 of these so-called purple machines. We called it the Purple Code. So there were 8 purple machines built by the U.S. Navy, and the first one became operational in late September 1940. A couple of weeks after Roosevelt met with Admiral Richardson. And the results were so astounding that the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, called it magic. So the product of the purple machine became known as magic intelligence, or just magic for short. So from late September 1940 until the end of World War II, the United States was able to break every single Japanese high-level diplomatic message all over the world. And we knew what the Japanese government was thinking insofar as the government was telling its own diplomats. Whatever they were telling their diplomats, we could read it very quickly with the purple machines that we built. There was another major code-breaking effort, and that was the attempts to break the Japanese Navy's operational code called JN-25, Japanese Navy 25. So the British were about 1 year ahead of us in this effort. So they began breaking JN-25 very effectively by December of 1939. And we first began breaking the JN-25 Japanese Navy military operational code in late September 1940, a little bit after we started breaking the diplomatic messages. Now, the Japanese Navy code, JN-25, was not a machine code. It couldn't be decrypted by a machine. It was a book code using code books and padding encipherment. I won't go into that here. It's in the book. And it was very laborious, very labor intensive. And the British and we knew it was a book code and we knew how to break it. It was just very, very labor intensive and very, very time consuming. And the British were about a year ahead of us, and they donated a lot more code breakers to breaking JN-25 than we did. So those two efforts will become a big part of our story very soon. Now let's talk about what President Roosevelt did to Admiral Richardson. After he met with him and quarreled about whether the fleet should remain in Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt decided to fire him. And Admiral Richardson read in the Kiplinger newsletter, if you can believe that, in an economic newsletter, he read a few weeks later that he was going to be fired by the president because he was against war with Japan. Like, what? In an economic newsletter? But it was true. The leak was true. And he was fired, and a year early. So on February 1st, 1941, Richardson was fired, and there was a major fleet reorganization of the U.S. Navy. So there was no longer Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. There were now 3 major fleet commands. The Asiatic Fleet, which was a 4-star general, Admiral Hart, which was very small, old ships, very small. There was the Atlantic Fleet with a 4-star admiral. This was Admiral Ernest J. King, who had been promoted from 2 stars to 4 stars as part of this reorganization. So he became Cinque Land Fleet. And then the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, Richardson, was relieved by the first commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. So on February 1st, Husband E. Kimmel was promoted to four-star admiral from two-star to four-star, and he relieved Richardson a year early, and he became the first sink-pack fleet in Pearl Harbor on February 1st. In August, Roosevelt and Churchill have decided, August 41, they've decided it's time we met each other face-to-face and got to know each other. So by this time, remember, the United States as a nation, and that includes the Congress, has decided to give Britain all the weapons it needs and other countries fighting the Axis, all the weapons they need. That includes China, the Chinese, it includes Greece. Give them all the weapons they need to fight the Axis free of charge. Quite a commitment. So these two leaders, Churchill and Roosevelt, decide they need to meet each other in person, get to know each other. So Churchill goes west on the battleship Prince of Wales, HMS Prince of Wales, who participated in the fight against the Bismarck in May. And in Prince of Wales was, you'll remember the Bismarck sank the hood. It was a catastrophic explosion of the hood. Only 3 people survived. And then the Prince of Wales was badly damaged, but limped away and got home and got repaired. So here comes the Prince of Wales into Argentia Bay on August the 9th, 1941, with Churchill on board. And Roosevelt has come up to meet him in secret on a U.S. heavy cruiser. 2 heavy cruisers went up there to meet Churchill, and the Augusta and the Tuscaloosa, forgive me. So Roosevelt was on the Augusta, and they met each other at sea and had a 4-day conference. The British came over hoping and expecting that they'd get a commitment from Roosevelt to declare war on Germany. Well, they didn't get that in public, and they didn't get anything close to that. The only document Roosevelt was willing to issue in public was something called the Atlantic Charter. But I'm here to tell you that was nothing but a propaganda document. That was a smokescreen by the devious politician, Franklin D. Roosevelt, to make it look like the conference really wasn't about very much. It was just a get-together session. That's the way he represented it afterwards. The Atlantic Charter basically said, Great Britain and the United States, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, it didn't say how this would happen. It said, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, we're going to make sure that there's a world that's better to live in, where all peoples have self-determination and where there's free trade for everybody. And we'll try to devise ways where we'll have a safer world where we don't have wars like this again. So that's really about all the Atlantic Charter said. And the real story about the Argentia Conference is the secret agreements Roosevelt made with Churchill, which the American people never knew about until many years later. So I'm going to tell you what those secret agreements were and why it's a Rosetta Stone in understanding how Pearl Harbor came about, how we entered World War II. So after the conference was over and Churchill got home and reported to his cabinet what Roosevelt had really said in private, and after those cabinet minutes were declassified many years later, we now know what Roosevelt promised in private to Churchill in August of 1941. So I'm going to read you the key segments from the cabinet minutes. This is what Churchill reported to his cabinet after the meeting with Roosevelt in August 41 on the Prince of Wales. This is really incredible stuff. Churchill says that he, quote, got on intimate terms with the president, unquote, and that Roosevelt personally, quote, was obviously determined that the Americans should come in, unquote, to the war. Now, Roosevelt told Churchill, quote, he would wage war but not declare it, unquote. That he, quote, would become more and more provocative, unquote, and that the Germans, if they did not like it, quote, could attack American forces, unquote. Roosevelt, quote, made it clear that he would look for an incident which would justify him in opening hostilities, end quote. Roosevelt told Churchill in private that if he asked for a declaration of war from the Congress at the present time, in August 41, that there would be a debate that would last for 3 months, which would have been true, by the way. And Roosevelt knew that even if he had carried the day and won the debate and the Congress had declared war, that we would have had a seriously divided country after that acrimonious debate, and we would have entered a major war without a united country, with a disunited country. So that so Churchill reported, quote, everything was to be done to force an incident at sea, unquote. So the other secret agreement that Roosevelt made with Churchill was that starting on September 1st, he would commence American convoying by the U.S. Navy of British merchant ships from Canada all the way to Iceland, and that the British Navy could then take over the convoys from Iceland to Great Britain, which wasn't a very long trip. So the long-awaited convoy decision had finally been made by Roosevelt. You know, he waited first until Hitler invaded the Soviet Union so that Hitler wouldn't have any reason to change his mind. And he decided at Argentia that I'm going to begin convoying all your merchant ships. I'll take over that job, take them all the way to Iceland, starting September 1st. Now, as it turns out, that effort didn't really begin until September 16th, because the next big convoy wasn't ready until September 16th, but it did begin on that date. And what Roosevelt knew would happen as soon as he started convoying is there would be incidents at sea between U.S. Navy ships and German U-boats. He knew that was inevitable. And remember, he had just told Churchill that I'm going to become more and more provocative in the attempts to provoke an incident. So what he wanted was a casus belli. A casus belli is a cause for war, an excuse for war. That's what he wanted. That's what historians call this, a casus belli. That's what Roosevelt was seeking. And he knew that as the leverage to get that to happen was the convoying decision, which he also made in secret at Argentia. So Roosevelt went home and Churchill went home, and they were both presented with a key diplomatic decrypted message, which had been broken by the Purple Machine, a Japanese diplomatic message from Berlin to Tokyo, from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin to Tokyo, that had gone out in August, while the two heads of state were still at sea. Roosevelt was coming home, Churchill was going home. So on August the 15th, the Japanese ambassador to Berlin, Baron Oshima, sent the following message to the foreign ministry in Tokyo, and the Purple Machine decoded it. So I was able to obtain the actual decrypt from the British National Archives in 2017. I don't believe it was declassified until the mid-1990s. And I had read about it in secondary sources, but believe me, it was misrepresented in secondary sources. So when I got my hands on this document in 2017, I really raised my eyebrows. I said, oh my God. So listen to this now. This is the Japanese ambassador in Berlin to the foreign ministry in Tokyo, August 15th, 1941. He said, when seeing Dietrich, I'll tell you who Dietrich was in a minute. When seeing Dietrich on the 9th of August on other business, Dietrich told me he had been at general headquarters until the previous day, and he had just returned to Berlin. While talking about the question of America, he said that Hitler had declared that in the event of a collision between Japan and the United States, Germany would at once open hostilities with America. In view of the fact that this talk with Dietrich was entirely fortuitous It's difficult to do other than accept this statement at face value, end quote. So once again, here's the key sentence in this memo. When talking about the question of America, Dietrich said that Hitler had declared that in the event of a collision between Japan and the United States, Germany would at once open hostilities with America, end quote. Wow. So I'm going to read you, that's the British decryption. Here's the American decryption from the same message. It's different only in tone for one or two sentences. On the 9th, when I called on Dietrich to discuss some other matter, Dietrich said he had been at headquarters until the previous day, and when the question of the United States came up in the course of a conversation, Hitler had said that if a clash occurs by any chance between Japan and the United States, Germany will at once open war against the United States, unquote. Oh, and it continued. In view of the fact that my meeting with Dietrich was not a prearranged one, I don't believe this conversation was premeditated, unquote. So the key sentence here, just a slight difference in nuance, was that, quote, Hitler said that if a clash occurs by any chance between Japan and the United States, Germany will at once open war with the United States, unquote. This is a big deal. I want all of you listeners to understand something. Roosevelt preferred to get into war with Germany through the front door. He preferred to get into war with Germany through naval incidents in the Atlantic that would create a war fever with the American public. And so that the American people, he was hoping, would demand war against Germany because of U-boat unrestricted warfare. This is what brought us into World War I, was unrestricted U-boat warfare by Germany in 1917. That's what created the moral outrage for the Americans to enter the war. So Roosevelt was hoping for a repeat of that. So he was hoping to enter through the front door. But this secret diplomatic message, decrypted by the British on August 23rd, decrypted by the Americans on August 15th, revealed that if we got into any kind of a scrap, any kind of hostilities with Japan, even if Japan started it, Hitler didn't care. Hitler would declare war on the United States. So this was a card that Roosevelt had in his hip pocket the rest of that summer and all during the autumn of 1941. He had this in his hip pocket. So to make a long story short, what happened was there were 3 incidents at sea, as Roosevelt has anticipated, between the U.S. Navy and German U-boats during the fall of 1941. So the first one, I'm going to summarize this very briefly. The first one was destroyer USS Greer had 2 torpedoes fired at it by a German U-boat on September the 4th. This was even before we started the convoying, but the Greer was in the vicinity of Iceland. We had U.S. troops defending Iceland, U.S. Marines, and the Greer was engaged in anti-submarine patrols and reporting the positions of U-boats to British airplanes. And the British airplanes were dropping depth charges on the German U-boat with the assistance of the Greer. Of course, Roosevelt didn't tell the American people that, but that's what was going on. So the U-boat fires 2 torpedoes at the Greer, and they both missed. So Roosevelt, there was a slight delay because his mother died at Hyde Park on September the 5th. But a few days later, he returns to Washington, and on September 11th, Roosevelt makes a major speech about this. And the press called it the shoot on sight speech, where Roosevelt called the U-boats the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. And he said, what's the first thing you do when you see a rattlesnake? You crush it with your boot. And he said, we're going to destroy these rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. And he went on to talk about how, the U-boat fired on the USS Greer, which was minding its own business, which really wasn't true. And so the press dubbed it the shoot on sight speech. A second incident occurred after the convoying began officially on the, oh, by the way, during the shoot on sight speech, Roosevelt said, we are going to do all we can to keep open the freedom of the seas and to keep the Germans from closing off the Atlantic to free trade. So that was his way of justifying the convoy decision. He never announced officially that I've begun convoying British ships from Canada to Iceland. That's a major commitment. It's a military commitment, military and diplomatic commitment, but primarily a military one. Okay, now the second of these three incidents at sea that provided the potential for a casus belli was the torpedoing of the USS Kearney on October 17th, 1941. So this time the U-boat that fired the torpedo actually hit the American destroyer. And the Kearney almost sank. This was near Iceland. And there was a noteworthy loss of life. And with some assistance, the ship barely made it back to Iceland. And Roosevelt went big on this. He gave a Navy Day speech on October 27, 1941, in which he pulled out all the stops and actually went over the top. He was over the top in his emotional appeals to the American people to go to war. It's clear that that's what he wanted. And I'm going to read some of the excerpts from the speech, and you're going to see how all in he was on this. This was his primary goal now, was to enter war with Germany through the front door, through actions at sea between the U.S. Navy and the German Kriegsmarine. So here are some quotes from his Navy Day speech on October 27, 41. We have wished to avoid shooting, but the shooting has started, and history has recorded who fired the first shot. In the long run, however, all that will matter is who fired the last shot. America has been attacked. The USS Kearney is not just a Navy ship. She belongs to every man, woman, and child in this nation. He then proceeded to read off a list of the states from where all the dead crew members were from. And then he says, Hitler's torpedo was directed at every American, whether he lives on our seacoasts or in the innermost part of our nation. And then he says, quote, the purpose of Hitler's attack was to frighten the American people off the high seas, to force us to make a trembling retreat. This is not the first time he has misjudged the American spirit. That spirit is now aroused. He goes on and actually went way over the top in describing purported German plans to take over South America and Central America and abridge freedoms of religion in the New World, quoting a map which is probably non-existent, or if it existed, it was probably just British propaganda. And so he gets off of that topic and gets back into the topic of what happened to the USS Kearney. And he says, the forward march of Hitler and of Hitlerism can be stopped, and it will be stopped. Very simply and very bluntly, FDR said, we are pledged to pull our own oar in the destruction of Hitlerism. Each day that passes, we are producing and providing more and more arms for the men who are fighting on actual battlefronts. That is our primary task. And it is the nation's will that these vital arms and supplies of all kinds shall neither be locked up in American harbors nor sent to the bottom of the sea. It is the nation's will that America shall deliver the goods. In open defiance of that will, our ships have been sunk and our sailors have been killed. Our determination to not take it lying down has been expressed in the orders to the American Navy to shoot on sight. these orders stand. Our American merchant ships must be armed to defend themselves against the rattlesnakes of the sea. Our American merchant ships must be free to carry our American goods into the harbors of our friends. Our American merchant ships must be protected by the American Navy. He continues, it can never be doubted that the goods will be delivered by this nation, whose Navy believes in the tradition of damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Our Navy is ready for action. Indeed, units of it in the Atlantic Patrol are in action. He goes on and on and on, and the end of his speech reads as follows. Today, in the face of this newest and greatest challenge of them all, we Americans have cleared our decks and taken our battle stations. We stand ready in the defense of our nation and the faith of our fathers to do what God has given us the power to see as our full duty, end quote. It's quite an emotional peroration he made. And you know what? It didn't work. All it did was excite and agitate the isolationist movement, who went nuts for this speech, because the intent was clear. He was hoping for some kind of spontaneous resolution of war in Congress, and nothing of the kind happened, except a lot of pushback. So just a few days later, on October 31st, the third of these three incidents at sea happened, and the U.S. destroyer, USS Reuben James, was sunk by a German torpedo, actually sunk with great loss of life. All the officers were killed. I think over 100 people died. And what did Roosevelt say about that? Absolutely nothing, because he knew that game was over. The thing he had promised to Churchill at Argentia was to become more and more provocative and hope for an incident at sea. And if the Germans didn't like it, they could attack U.S. ships. So this had happened 3 times now, and he knew it wasn't going to work. There was going to be no natural war fever arising from these incidents at sea between American destroyers and German U-boats. So he said nothing about the third incident, even though it was the most serious of the 3 incidents. So at this point, by October 31st, 1941, I would say by the next day, by November 1st, Roosevelt knew he could no longer go to war against Hitler, which was his primary goal, through the front door. He was going to have to use the back door. And the thing is, he had this card in his hip pocket from August. He had the magic decrypted message where Hitler had indicated to this general, Sepp Dietrich, in August, that if by any chance Japan gets into a clash with America, I will make war on the United States. So he had that card in his hip pocket. And the one thing I haven't done yet is tell you who Sepp Dietrich was. So in that message, and you get to read a facsimile of the actual decrypted message on the last page of my book. It's on page 438, the actual message that I got from the British National Archives. And I also put it in a special chapter where you can read it, where the text is bigger. The Japanese ambassador mentioned meeting with somebody named Dietrich. So I want to tell the audience who Dietrich was. Dietrich was Sepp Dietrich. Sepp Dietrich had been Hitler's chauffeur in the 1920s, member of the SS. Then he became the head of the SS bodyguard during the 1920s. Hitler's elite bodyguard, the SS guys in the black uniforms with the skulls on their collars and the skulls on their uniform caps. And then when the war began when the war against the West began in the spring of 1940, Sepp Dietrich had become an SS general and commanded SS combat units against the Netherlands and France. So this was a trusted confidant that Hitler was speaking to in that decrypted message. So it wasn't just some promise that Hitler made to a diplomat. This was his innermost thoughts spoken to a confidant, one of the, what they called the early fighters from the early days of the Nazi movement. So for this reason, Roosevelt and Churchill could believe what was in that telegram. I mean, they knew Hitler was serious. He was revealing his innermost intentions. So, Roosevelt had no reason not to believe what was in that decrypted message, that if we got into an armed conflict with Japan for any reason, Hitler would make war on America, and then that would solve his problem. So what happened during November is that on the surface, the United States was pursuing détente with Japan. And by that, I mean this diplomatic arrangement called the modus vivendi. Modus vivendi is a Latin phrase that means a way of living together. So what the Japanese were pursuing in Washington and what the United States was pursuing with them was a modus vivendi, which would be a temporary calming down period and a way to postpone what seemed like an inevitable war with Japan, to postpone it for at least 3 months. So both the Japanese ambassadors in Washington and Secretary of State Cordell Hull, at Roosevelt's urging, were pursuing a modus vivendi. And what the Americans did not know was that the oil embargo had had a dramatic effect in Japan. The oil embargo imposed by the funds freeze on July 26, 1941, by August, we know now that internally, the Japanese army had decided we cannot invade the Soviet Union this year. It's not possible without a source of oil. So we're going to have to go south, expand to the south, and get the oil from the Dutch East Indies by conquering that Dutch colony. And so that decision had been made in August. And on September the 6th, unknown to the Americans, on September the 6th, at an imperial conference blessed by the Emperor of Japan with the entire liaison council present, which is the heads of the military, the imperial conference had decided we are going to prepare for war with Great Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. And at the same time, we'll pursue diplomacy. And if the diplomacy is not successful by early October, then we'll go to war with America and Great Britain and the Netherlands. They made that decision on September the 6th, and we didn't know it. So in November, Roosevelt and Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, and the Japanese diplomats, they knew nothing about Pearl Harbor, by the way. They knew war was a high likelihood. They knew nothing about the Pearl Harbor attack. So they were proceeding toward this modus vivendi, this temporary easing of tensions to try to restore a flow of some of the oil, and maybe the Japanese troops would withdraw from southern French Indochina, withdraw back into northern French Indochina as a sign of good faith, blah, blah, blah. So by the 25th of November, the US cabinet, Roosevelt's unofficial war council, this is his Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Army, the head of the Army, George Marshall, the head of the Navy, Admiral Stark, and his Secretary of State, they had all approved this modus vivendi, this attempt to postpone a war for at least 3 months by making nice with Japan for a while. And by November 25th, this had been approved by us. And in fact, at the same time this was happening, Roosevelt made a very revealing statement in a cabinet meeting, which was recorded in the diary of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. So it's very important that I read this to you. The mainstream historians don't like this quote, and they either ignore it or try to poo-poo it as if it didn't mean very much. Well, it means a lot because it reveals Roosevelt's inner intentions, okay? So remember what the McCollum Memorandum had said when he wanted Roosevelt to shift, from deterrence to provocation, was that if we can get Japan to commit an overt act, so much the better, because then we can knock them out. So at this cabinet meeting on November 25th, right before Roosevelt and everybody else thought the modus vivendi was going to be implemented, Stimson recorded this in his diary that the president said, quote, this is FDR now, on November 25th. The real problem is, how do we maneuver them, the Japanese, how do we maneuver them into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves, unquote. That's the president of the United States saying that in private to his war council, what would become his war cabinet in a very short amount of time. And after the war, Stimson testified as follows when he was asked by Congress to comment upon that statement made by the president. And so Stimson testified as follows after the war, during the congressional investigation. He said, in our view, it was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, to fire the first shot, so that there would remain no doubt in anyone's mind as to who were the aggressors, end quote. And then George Marshall said this was his attitude at the time when he testified before Congress. His attitude was, when war begins with Japan, the Japanese must be given no opportunity whatever to claim that we had taken some overt act which forced a state of war upon them. If they create a situation, however unjustified, however logical, in which they could lead even a portion of our people to believe that our overt action had forced them into an act of war, we would have a divided country, which would be a terrible tragedy in a war situation. They both endorsed at the time, both Marshall and Stimson. This is the Secretary of War, Stimson, and the Secretary of the Army, George Marshall, endorsing the fact that the Japanese had to be placed in position to fire the first shot before we went to war with them. We couldn't fire the first shot or we'd have a divided country. That happened. Now, I want to back up just 3 days and a little bit more and tell you what was happening in Japan, because it becomes a major part of this story, of the Pearl Harbor story. War games were held in Japan, tabletop war games in September and October. Wargaming their entire war plans to expand to the south and to the southeast, which meant taking over Thailand, taking over British Malaya, taking over the British colony of Singapore at the tip of Malaya, eventually invading the Dutch East Indies, and eventually invading the Philippines. And the tabletop games also included Yamamoto's pet project, which was attacking the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor on the first day of the war. The interesting thing about Yamamoto, Admiral Yamamoto, was the head of the Japanese combined fleet. He was not the head of the entire Navy. The head of the entire Navy was the head of the Japanese Imperial Naval Staff. That was Admiral Nagano. So Nagano was the head of the Japanese Navy Imperial Staff. But the head of the fleet, the one who would actually control the fleet during the war, was Yamamoto. And Yamamoto had recommended actually attacking Pearl Harbor back in January of 1941. He said, if war becomes inevitable, only if it becomes inevitable, we should do this on the first day of the war to destroy American morale and destroy their will to fight, because he knew that Japan could not win a long war with the United States. They didn't have the industrial capacity to build enough airplanes, to build ships fast enough, and they wouldn't have enough oil. So he knew that the only way they could win a war with the United States was if they had a short war, a short victorious war lasting 6 months or a year. And the only way to win a short war, he thought, was to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet on the first day of the war. The Japanese imperial staff, the Navy staff, never wanted to do that. They thought it was too dangerous, and they could see, losing, oh my God, we're going to lose most of our aircraft carriers. It's too dangerous a risk. So they never supported it. Well, Yamamoto, because of the force of his personality, he was a brilliant man, finally forced them into agreeing to do this in October. But even then, they didn't want to commit all 6 of their big aircraft carriers. They only wanted to use 3 of them, 4 at the most, but generally only 3 of them. So Yamamoto was so upset about these war games, where the staff revealed its lukewarm support, that he threatened to resign in the month of October. He threatened to resign as the head of the combined fleet, along with his entire staff. This is at a time when he knew his country was headed for war with the United States. They were headed for war, and he knew it. And he threatened to resign if he didn't get his way, if they didn't approve the attack as he envisaged it with all 6 large aircraft carriers. So he carried out his threat to resign in October, at which point the Japanese imperial staff caved in and said, okay, you got it. He was too good a leader and too forceful a personality to have him resigning right before the war. So he got his way. So on November 7th, Yamamoto issued orders for all the ships in the Pearl Harbor Task Force to assemble way up north in a remote place called Hitokapu Bay, which is in the Kurile Islands, north of the main island of Honshu in Japan. So if you look at a map, you'll see the main island is Honshu, and then there's an island above that called Hokkaido, and then way above that is a string of islands called the Kurile Islands. So Hitokapu Bay was way up north. The Pearl Harbor Task Force of 30 ships were told to assemble there on November 22nd, by no later than November 22nd. That's all the message said. But this was sent out in the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code. All the other ships in the Japanese Navy, we knew from radio traffic, were assembling down south. We're assembling in Southeast Asia in what we now call Vietnam. We're assembling in southern China. And they were ready to move south. We knew that. So on November 22nd, Yamamoto made a serious blunder from the standpoint of operational security. He sent out an attack order for the Pearl Harbor attack over the radio in a message that could be intercepted because it went out on the radio waves to the entire First Air Fleet, which was the attack force coming at Pearl Harbor. And I'm going to read you the text of this message, which the mainstream historians do not want to talk about. They do not want to talk about this message. And thank God Robert Stinnett talked about it in his book, Day of Deceit, in the year 2000. So I'm going to read you his attack order for the Pearl Harbor operation, which Yamamoto sent out on November 22nd. From the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet to the First Air Fleet, those are the 6 big aircraft carriers in the Japanese Navy and all of their escorts. The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities, shall attack the main force of the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order. On completion of the air raid, the task force shall speedily leave enemy waters and return to Japan. Now, here's a very important sentence. The last sentence in the order says this: should the negotiations with the United States prove successful, the task force shall hold itself in readiness forthwith to return and reassemble. End quote. I'm going to interpret that for you. What he's saying is, if the negotiations, which have been going on for months, since February 41, and which are going on even now, if they are successful, you will not attack Hawaii, and instead you will turn around, reassemble, and come home, and you will not carry out the attack. A remarkable statement, a remarkable caveat for an attack order. But let's go back to the most important sentence in the attack order. The task force shall advance into Hawaiian waters. That's the first use of the word Hawaii, into Hawaiian waters. And upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal it a mortal blow. Okay. Now, it's my contention, I'm going to cut to the chase here to save some time, that the British JN-25 decoding effort, which was a year ahead of ours and much more sophisticated than ours, that they decoded this message. We know they had time to send it back to London, the decryption back to London, because people later said they did so. 3 of their codebreakers told later historians that we gave a warning about this to London, and we told them to pass it on to Roosevelt into Pearl Harbor. But we know we notified London, and they sent the warning back to London. It's my contention that Churchill, almost certainly, I'm as certain as I can be, that he turned around and sent this decrypted message to Franklin Roosevelt so that he had it in his hands by the morning of November 26th, 1941. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, it was possible. The British had a secret means of communication with their number one propaganda and intelligence agent in the US that bypassed the State Department. So this Canadian, William Stevenson, the man called Intrepid, who later wrote his own book, William Stevenson ran the British supply mission in New York City, which was responsible for getting all the Lend-Lease aid from the United States. It was also his job to mold American public opinion and get us to the American public to be in favor of entering the war. He operated out of Rockefeller Center, New York City. They had a secret underwater cable, which didn't have to use radio broadcasts that went through the air, an underwater cable, which wasn't tapped, directly to the East Coast, which ended up in his office in New York City. And it had been used before for various things. So it's my contention that Churchill sent this decrypted Yamamoto message of 22 November to Roosevelt in time for him to get it on the morning of November 26th. Now, what happened the day after that? The day after that, on November 27th, after Roosevelt had sent Japan a brutal ultimatum, which had not been the plan. He sent them an ultimatum, which I'll talk about in a minute. Roosevelt sent his son back up to New York City and had him send a message to Churchill on this secret circuit from Stevenson's office to Bletchley Park. And that message said, negotiations are off, expect action within 2 weeks. So that message that James Roosevelt, the son of the president, drove back up to New York and had transmitted on the 27th, that message was clearly a reply to something else. Negotiations are off, expect action within 2 weeks. Services expect action within 2 weeks. So I believe it was a response to the message about the forthcoming Japanese attack. Now, how do we know that the message about the Japanese attack was sent? It's very important that you understand this. We have 2 sources. One source was a publication made by the US government in 1946 called The Campaigns of the Pacific War. And it contained the results of all the interviews that had been done of the Japanese prisoners of war right after they surrendered. The US Army interviewed, and US civilians interviewed the key surviving Army and Japanese naval officers, immediately interviewed them. And so they all recalled this key message that Yamamoto sent out on November 22nd. They recalled the exact text. And so that ended up in this 1946 U.S. government publication called Campaigns of the Pacific War. And that's what Robert Stinnett published in his book, Day of Deceit. He didn't understand that it was not an intercepted message. It was not one that we intercepted with our own code breaking. It was one, though, that was published by the U.S. government. Also, this message was discussed in the congressional hearings. So the congressional hearings into the Pearl Harbor attack went on for many, many months, and they published a huge report of many, many volumes. And this was in that report as well. And in fact, in that report, the congressional report corrected the date that it was transmitted. So the Army originally thought that message went out on November 25th. And the congressional report corrected that and said, no, this message was actually transmitted on November 22nd. And that's important to me because it would have given the British the necessary time to decode the message, because JN-25 descriptions took some time. They took hours, not minutes. And then send it to London by secure means and give the London chiefs of staff and Churchill time to read it and time to decide what to do about it. So this gave 3 days for Churchill and his cabinet and his military leaders, and Churchill especially, to decide what to do. And so why have I inferred that Roosevelt received a decryption of this message on the morning of November 26th? Because on November 26th, he made the biggest U-turn in American history, the biggest U-turn in American foreign policy in American history. On the morning of November 26th, Roosevelt called his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, over to the White House from across the street in the executive office building. He called him over and he said, "We're not going to send the modus vivendi anymore. I want you to send this." And Roosevelt handed Cordell Hull an ultimatum to Japan, a very stern ultimatum, which they clearly, couldn't swallow and couldn't accept. And this had been written 8 days before by someone on the staff of Henry Morgenthau. Henry Morgenthau was a war hawk. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. He had already wanted Roosevelt to declare war on Germany the previous spring. So had Stimson, and so had Secretary Knox and a lot of other people. So Morgenthau had presented this ultimatum to Japan at the time when we were negotiating the modus vivendi. Roosevelt ignored it at first. So the question has to be, what made him change his mind overnight and abandon this modus vivendi, which would have delayed war by at least 3 months and given Japan a little more oil in exchange for them pulling out of southern French Indochina as a sign of good faith? What made him abandon the modus vivendi, accommodation, and adopt a really hard-nosed attitude? And I have concluded that it must have been the Yamamoto attack order that Churchill clearly sent to him, and which Roosevelt clearly read the morning of the 26th. Now, I want to read to you what Cordell Hull said in anger when he returned from his meeting at the White House the morning of November 26th. Roosevelt called Cordell Hull over to the White House, told him, "We're not going to have a modus vivendi. I want you to send this ultimatum." And here's what Cordell Hull said to an assistant named Landreth Harrison when he came back over from the White House 15 minutes later. Quote, "Those men over there do not believe me when I tell them the Japanese will attack us. You cannot give an ultimatum to a powerful and proud people and not expect them to resist violently." So that was Cordell Hull's attitude. And Admiral Kimmel in Pearl Harbor, he's the head of the Pacific Fleet. He was about to become the victim of the Pearl Harbor attack. His intelligence officer, Edwin Layton, later wrote a book called "I Was There" for Pearl Harbor and Midway. And Layton later wrote in his memoirs that it was clear to him that Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, was, quote, "the reluctant executor of a direct presidential order," unquote. In other words, he was forced to send the Hull note, which is really the Morgenthau note, which was really written by Harry Dexter White 8 days prior. And so what did the Hull note say? It was sent out late on the afternoon of November 26th. So the Japanese were not expecting this. First of all, it said, you must conclude a multilateral non-aggression pact and sign it with us that you will never attack the British Empire or the Dutch East Indies. You have to negotiate that and sign it along with us. They then said, oh, and you won't attack Thailand either. This was the thing that was even more unacceptable. The Hull note said, the government of Japan will withdraw all military, naval, air, and police forces from China and Indochina. What? So you see, the modus vivendi had avoided the subject of China because we knew the Japanese couldn't win the war in China. They'd been fighting there for 4 years. And withdrawal from China was unacceptable to them. It was their Vietnam times 10. It was very serious to them. So instead of avoiding talking about China, the modus vivendi had only said, we want you to remove your troops from southern Vietnam back into northern Vietnam as a sign of good faith. But the Hull note says you got to remove all your troops from China and Indochina. It also says you won't recognize any government in China except the government of Chiang Kai-shek, which was the Japanese enemy. He was the head of the nationalist Chinese armies, which the Japanese were fighting. So it also said, and if you do all these things, we'll turn on the oil again. We'll have negotiations and resume normal economic and trade relations. So the Hull note was perceived as an ultimatum by Japan. And I mentioned Commander Rochefort earlier. Commander Joe Rochefort, who was in charge of the Navy code breaking at Pearl Harbor, later said during his oral history in 1970, he said, quote, I believe sincerely that the November 26 message, he means the Hull note, the November 26 message was an actual ultimatum the Japanese could not accept, and their only alternative was to go to war, unquote. So that's what happened. And then, so you see what you must understand what Roosevelt's goal was. Yamamoto's attack order had said on November 22nd, he had told his First Air Fleet, you're going to attack the U.S. fleet in Hawaiian waters and destroy it, unless our negotiations are successful. And if they are, you will turn around, reassemble, and come home. And Roosevelt's goal clearly was to make sure the negotiations weren't successful, because he could only enter the war against Germany now through the back door. He couldn't enter the war against Germany that he wanted through the front door. That had failed. The 3 incidents in the Atlantic had not resulted in a casus belli. There was no war fever in the United States. So, in fact, after those 3 incidents in the Atlantic, the number of people in the United States who did not want to fight Germany was about 80%. 2/3 of the American people supported all aid to Great Britain short of war, but about 80% of the American people did not want to fight Germany. And Roosevelt knew that. So the Hull note was designed to make sure the negotiations, which were almost at the end, were not successful, and that this attack would take place. Now, one of the lies that's been told by mainstream historians over the years is that the Japanese fleet heading toward Pearl Harbor was under complete radio silence, and therefore we had no way of knowing that they were coming. Well, that's not true. Robert Stinnett helped expose that. John Toland, another historian, helped expose that, but I've got the best evidence of all, and that is the report of the Congressional Committee into the Pearl Harbor attack. So the Congressional Committee published evidence in 1946 that said the Navy had intercepted radio traffic on November 30th between the Akagi, which was the principal Japanese aircraft carrier in charge of the attack. The Akagi was the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack force, and she had been underway since November 26th. So they intercepted radio traffic between the Akagi and several oil tankers in an attempt to get oil. And they intercepted it on November 30th, and that went into a Navy report on November 30th. So this proves that the story about radio silence is a myth. Now, it's true Yamamoto ordered radio silence, but the order said, except in cases of extreme emergency. And as it turned out, there were conditions of extreme emergency. The Japanese task force sailed on November 26th. It had to sail through two major storms. So the first major storm was just prior to November 30th. And a lot of the ships got separated at sea, especially the oil tankers. The 7 oil tankers were very slow and got separated from the warships. So they had to be rounded up with low power radio transmissions. So the Japanese, clearly on the Akagi, they thought, well, we've got to get our tankers in close to us so we can refuel. We have to refuel on the way to Hawaii or we won't be able to make it home. So they told these ships where they were by radio, and these transmissions were picked up by the United States listening network. The United States Navy had a listening network all over the Pacific, which meant, for the most part, it meant the Philippines, Hawaii, Alaska, and then a lot of stations in the state of Washington and the state of California. So this West Coast listening network, which could intercept messages and do radio direction finding on what direction they were coming from, picked up these signals between Akagi and the oil tankers. And so the result of this, and by the way, an ocean liner, the SS Lurline, a Matson company liner, picked up a lot of these radio transmissions as well when it was traveling from the west coast of the U.S. to Hawaii shortly before the Pearl Harbor. They picked up the radio transmissions only. So why is this important? The reason it's important to understand that there was not complete radio silence is because we have two key diary entries which record the foreknowledge of the coming Pearl Harbor attack by the Office of Naval Intelligence. And believe me, if the Office of Naval Intelligence knew, then the president knew. ONI is not going to withhold key strategic information like that from the American president, especially not from the Navy president who loves the Navy. So the person who made the diary entries was someone that the U.S. Navy trusted implicitly. His name was Johan Raneft. He was Dutch Navy Captain Johan Raneft. He became Dutch naval attaché to the United States in 1938. He had become personal friends with, believe it or not, Arthur McCollum at the Office of Naval Intelligence. They were friends. And so Raneft recorded two key diary entries on December 2nd and December 6th, which I want to read to you. They were a big part of Stennett's book in the year 2000. And they're very important historically. Stennett, first of all, Raneft was Dutch naval attaché to the United States for 9 years, from 1938 through 1947. You get that? From before we entered World War II, from before World War II started until well after it was over. And so there's one famous picture of the most beloved American admiral in history, Admiral Chester Nimitz. There's one fantastic photo of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is now a fleet admiral, a five-star admiral in 1946, giving the Legion of Merit Award to Rear Admiral Raneft in 1946. So this is the year after the war ended. Chester Nimitz was no longer SINCPAC. He was no longer SINCPAC fleet. He was now the chief of naval operations after the war was over. And here he is giving a medal to Rear Admiral Johann Raneft for his services to the U.S. Navy. So this tells you all you need to know about the relationship between Raneft and the U.S. Navy. He was completely trusted, and he had carte blanche with ONI in 1941. I'm going to tell you why he had carte blanche with ONI. Why they would admit him to their most secret inner sanctums, and why he was able to make these diary entries. It was because he was a spy on behalf of the Allies. In 1940, he stole the plans to the world's best anti-aircraft gun, the Bofors cannon. The Bofors gun, the 45 millimeter pom-pom gun, which you see in all the World War II newsreels on U.S. Navy ships in the Pacific, he stole the plans from that and gave them to the United States Navy at the risk of his career. It was a joint Dutch-Swedish design. He gave the blueprints to the U.S. Navy. We built it, we tested it, and we made tens of thousands of those weapons and put them on all of our ships. And because he had done such a great service for us, he had free run of ONI. Besides, he dealt with intelligence all the time. He was the Dutch naval attaché for the government in exile in London. So he published his diary entries in 1952 in the Dutch language. And Robert Stinnett got them translated. Actually, John Toland had gotten them translated earlier, an historian. And then Robert Stinnett wanted to double check the translation. So he checked with the Dutch embassy in San Francisco, and he also checked with the Ministry of Defense in The Hague in the Netherlands. So here's what the diary entry says for December 2nd, 1941. Quote, meeting at the Navy Department, the location of two Japanese carriers leaving Japan with an eastern course are pointed out to me on the map, unquote. So the key words here are eastern course. You'll also note he says two carriers. Well, I think that's because these radio intercepts by the ONI listening stations all over the Pacific, they were imperfect. They didn't really know that it was six carriers. They only thought it was two carriers. So they only had part of the story. So Raneft's diary tells you what ONI knew on December the 2nd. The location of two Japanese carriers leaving Japan with an eastern course are pointed out to me on the map. Okay. Now, the biggest diary entry is the one from December 6th. So here's the diary entry from December 6th, 1941, from Raneft's diary. At 1400, that's 2:00 p.m., at 1400 to the Navy Department, the department is closed, except the division ONI, where a night watch is kept. Everyone present at ONI confer with the director, Admiral Wilkinson. Captain McCollum, he's been promoted by this time, so Arthur McCollum's no longer a commander, he's now a captain. Captain McCollum, Lieutenant Commander Kramer. Kramer was a Navy translator and one of the couriers for the magic diplomatic messages every day. So he says, everyone present at ONI confer. Director Admiral Wilkinson, Captain McCollum, Lieutenant Commander Kramer. At my request, they show me the location of the two carriers west of Honolulu. I ask, what is the meaning of these carriers in this location? Whereupon I receive the answer that it is probably in connection with Japanese reports of eventual American action. No one among us mentions the possibility of an attack on Honolulu. I myself do not think about it because I believe that everyone in Honolulu is 100% on the alert, just like everyone here at ONI, end quote. So ONI on December 6th still thinks it's only 2 carriers. That's called the fog of war. They don't know there's 6 carriers. So they have some radio transmissions from Japanese carriers talking to tankers, but they only think there's 2 carriers. They got that part wrong. The fact that they're heading east across the North Pacific, they got that part right. So he mentions Honolulu. I just want the readers to understand the city of Honolulu is on the island of Oahu, the same island where Pearl Harbor is. It's right next door to Pearl Harbor. It's just adjacent to Pearl Harbor. So the fact that he says Honolulu here instead of Pearl Harbor is not a significant difference. So he says that the 2 carriers are still plotted on the chart on December 6th, heading toward Honolulu. But he's not concerned about it because he thinks everybody's on the alert. So I'm just telling you that the ONI knew that Japanese carriers were traveling east across the North Pacific to attack Hawaii. And if the ONI knew, that means Roosevelt knew, period. So you can infer, as I have, that Roosevelt probably received the Yamamoto attack order from the British on November 26th. Otherwise, he would not have implemented the biggest U-turn in American diplomatic history and gone from minor appeasement of the Japanese to a hard-nosed ultimatum. But this is the actual proof. These diary entries are the proof. So let's turn now to the reaction of Roosevelt. Oh, by the way, I want to back up one day. On December the 5th, there was a cabinet meeting in the White House. It was the last cabinet meeting before December 7th. Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, was a close observer of FDR. She had been his Secretary of Labor since 1933. She ended up serving him for 12 years. She knew him very well. So she recorded for her oral history with Columbia University in 1955 some very frank observations about Franklin Roosevelt and his true inner state in her oral history with Columbia. So she records it at the cabinet meeting on December 5th. The Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, is talking to the cabinet. And of course, Roosevelt is there. And Knox, we learned from a Time magazine article in the early 1950s that Knox had just received a briefing from the head of Office of Naval Intelligence about the location of the Japanese aircraft carriers. I'm not making this stuff up. Frank Knox on December 5th had just received a briefing from Admiral Wilkinson, the head of ONI, about the location of Japanese carriers. This was published in Time magazine in 1954. So then at the cabinet meeting, he blurts out to the cabinet and to the president, "Mr. President, we know where the Japanese fleet is." And Roosevelt says, "Oh, yeah, right, Frank. Why don't you tell us about it?" And Roosevelt's giving him some really intense looks. And Perkins is recording this later in her oral history in 1955 that Roosevelt was a bit alarmed. And he tells Frank Knox, "Well, okay, Frank, why don't you tell us about it?" So Frank, I'll just simplify this. Frank Knox proceeds to begin to talk about the location of the Japanese fleet, most of which was traveling south, but part of which was traveling east toward Pearl Harbor. And Roosevelt basically interrupts him and says, "Well, they're going south, right?" He doesn't let Frank Knox say what he's about to say because Roosevelt's afraid he's going to talk about the carriers heading toward Hawaii. So he interrupts him and says, "Well, they're traveling south, right?" And Knox says, "Well, yeah." And Roosevelt then throws a ringer in and he says, "But they could just as easily be traveling north. Right, Frank?" And of course, Frank Knox knows that's not true. And he says, "What do you mean north?" And so they have this little argument in front of these other people in the room that don't know what's going on. And especially Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, doesn't know what's going on. And Roosevelt says, well, they could just as easily be traveling north. You don't really have any firm idea of where they're going. And Knox says, well, I think we do. They're not engaged in exercises. They're engaged in real operations. And a lot of them are going south. And then so the other people in the cabinet picked up on the hints and they said, they may be heading for British Malaya and Singapore. That's what Roosevelt wanted people to think. So he basically preempts what Frank Knox is about to blurt out and changes and doesn't let Frank Knox say what he wants to say. And Frances Perkins records in her diary that night that something was really wrong here. I don't know what it was, but something was amiss. So then on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, Franklin Roosevelt is the only one that remains calm. He's the eye of the storm. His own wife said that he was as cold as an iceberg. Eleanor Roosevelt said that. Everyone around him was overly excited. He was as cold as an iceberg and remained calm the whole day. And everyone else basically said the same thing. Now, when he met with the cabinet that night, Roosevelt was in a somewhat of a frazzled state because by that time, by 8:30 that night, when he met with Frances Perkins again and the rest of the cabinet, they knew how many ships had been sunk at Pearl Harbor and that 4 battleships had been sunk. One had been seriously damaged and was half sunk, the Nevada. The ships that were sunk were the California, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the Arizona. But the other battleship that was seriously damaged was the Nevada, which had to be beached to keep it from sinking, and 3 other battleships lightly damaged. And he was aware that the loss of life was very great and that the battle line had been essentially destroyed and wasn't usable anymore. And he was a bit dismayed by the amount of the damage that night. And she observed that during the cabinet meeting, and she observed him acting in what she considered to be a duplicitous manner and hiding something from his audience. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew something was wrong and that he was hiding something. And she was judging this for his facial expression and the way he spoke and the way he behaved and by his nonverbal communications. And she recorded all this in detail in 1955 in her oral history at Columbia. And so I want to record for you what Harry Hopkins, the president's #1 aide in all affairs, said in a memo that he wrote the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. So on December 7th, pardon me, I'm going to page 411 at the end of the book. Okay, here we go. Getting close to the end, folks. Just a little more patience on your part. So the War Cabinet met that afternoon about 3 o'clock. And purportedly, Roosevelt was icy calm. And here's what Hopkins wrote in a memo that night, Harry Hopkins, who had been Secretary of Commerce, who had then resigned because of poor health in 1940, and then lived in the White House and was essentially the assistant president for Roosevelt. Hopkins wrote this on December 7th at night. The conference met in not too tense an atmosphere because I think that all of us believe that in the last analysis, the enemy was Hitler and that he could never be defeated without force of arms, that sooner or later we were bound to be in the war and that Japan had given us an opportunity, end quote. So this was the attitude of Harry Hopkins, the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, and that was clearly the attitude of Frank Roosevelt. Now, I think the reason why Roosevelt was a little unbalanced for about half a day in terms of devastated by the amount of the damage was that he believed O&I, and he thought there were only 2 carriers headed for Hawaii, and he expected it would be a hit-and-run raid, and then it wouldn't do that much damage, but it would get us into the war because the American people would be mad as hell. And so the reason you would have let something like that transpire was because if you only thought it was 2 carriers and you didn't think it was 6, and if you didn't think Japanese could operate torpedoes in shallow waters like Pearl Harbor, which is the way most of the Navy was thinking at the time, we didn't know the Japanese had developed special torpedoes that could run in very shallow water. We didn't know that. That's a secret weapon, if you were. We also didn't know the Japanese had converted 16-inch battleship shells into armor-piercing bombs, and that these huge armor-piercing bombs could penetrate the armored decks of battleships. We didn't know that either. So the Japanese used 2 special weapons at Pearl Harbor we didn't know they had, and they had 6 carriers headed toward Hawaii, not 2. So I think Roosevelt expected minor damage from a hit-and-run raid. So he was set back by the amount of damage and off his game Sunday night. But he had recovered by the next day and gave a stirring speech asking Congress to declare war, and they did. But you'll note that FDR did not request a declaration of war on Germany and Italy, even though Germany was his primary goal. Fighting Germany was Roosevelt's primary goal, and he did not request that Congress declare war against Germany. That's because he had the message in his hip pocket. He knew that Germany was going to declare war on America once America got into a fight with Japan. And Hitler followed through 4 days later on December 11th. Italy and Germany declared war on the United States, and the United States Congress obliged on the very same day. So that's the story that I present in the McCollum Memorandum. Overnight, American public isolationism died. It was dead overnight. During the vote for the declaration of war against Japan, there was only one dissenting vote in the House. There were no dissenting votes in the Senate. And 4 days later, on December 11th, when Hitler did exactly what he promised he would do to Sepp Dietrich, when Hitler declared war, along with Mussolini on December 11th, there were no dissenting votes in either the House or the Senate. So isolationism died overnight, and it was because of military actions that took place in the field. There was a casus belli. The casus belli was Pearl Harbor. Now, there's an obvious moral dimension to the matter. It's like the elephant in the room that you can't escape. So I'd just like to talk, if you don't mind, for just a few minutes about that and give my 2 cents worth on the moral dimension. And then I know Dr. Corsi's going to want to weigh in on this also. So I'm going to go back now that I've finished talking about the main points in the book. And I'm going to read part of the dedication. And then I'm going to explain what I meant. And then I'm going to explain how each reader needs to approach this story. In other words, make his own determinations. So here's what I wrote in the dedication. To the memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, savior of his country from 1933 to 1936, defender of Western civilization from 1940 to 1945, and champion of freedom. And then I went on and I said the following. He employed all of his political skills, persuasion, dissembling, duplicity, and iron resolve to pull the world out of the dark abyss. His sober appreciation of the overwhelming danger to civilization posed by Nazi Germany and to a lesser extent by Imperial Japan earned him a deserved place in history, above that of all U.S. presidents. He was a Machiavellian master of realpolitik, employed in the pursuit of altruistic core values. I'm going to repeat the last sentence because it'll challenge many of you and explain what I meant by that. I said he was a Machiavellian master of realpolitik, employed in the pursuit of altruistic core values. So from the standpoint of Roosevelt, the altruistic core value that I'm referring to here is his desire, not just his desire, he saw a need for the United States to fight Nazi Germany on the battlefield and ensure their defeat, and along with them, Imperial Japan. He felt it was an absolute necessity, and he felt actually democracy was failing in that he had done all he could throughout 1940 and 41 in press conferences and in speeches to persuade the American people that we needed to do all we could to support the Allies in the war against Nazi Germany and fascism. But all he had done was to persuade the American people to provide materiel aid. The American people in late November and early December of 1941, 80% of them did not want to fight Nazi Germany. So he knew that he had only carried us so far with rhetoric, and he couldn't carry us any farther with rhetoric, that he couldn't do that. It was going to take events on the world stage to carry the American people one step farther where they were willing to fight the bandit nations on the battlefield. So he felt that getting the American people to a place where they could do that as a united people, that was the altruistic aim that he was supporting with his Machiavellian manipulations. So my attitude in writing the book was not necessarily to make every reader agree that they loved Franklin Roosevelt or that they agreed with what he did, with the way he did it, with his means. I wanted the readers to understand what was going on in his mind, what his thought process was, and what his goals were, and what his inner thoughts were. And I wanted you to have a realistic understanding of what was really motivating him and what he was really trying to accomplish, as opposed to what he said in public, which was often quite a bit different. So the moral aspect on whether you remain an FDR lover, as I do, in spite of the means he employed, or whether you can never forgive FDR for getting us into the war the way that he did, that moral aspect is a determination that each reader has to make for himself. And it's a difficult problem, because if the United States had not entered World War II in time to make a difference on the battlefield, and if the Axis had won the war, we'd be living in a very different world today. You know, all you have to do is watch that Amazon Prime miniseries, The Man in the High Castle, to see what a different world it would have been if we had not entered the war and the Allies had not won the war. So that's kind of my perspective on it. But the moralistic angle here that each reader has to consider is the means that were employed. And Roosevelt was simply, I made sure the reader understood, Roosevelt was sure that he couldn't do anything more of his speeches. He had made all the speeches he could make. He had done all the persuading he could do. And he couldn't persuade, in his own mind, he could not persuade the American people with any number of speeches to want to enter the war as a belligerent and fight the Axis. He couldn't do that. They weren't there. So if you perceive, as I did, that democracy was actually failing because the public had the wrong attitude about World War II, they wanted to sit it out, most people, and that they needed to be led into the right direction, come hell or high water, and made to do the right thing, then you can say, as I did, that I think Roosevelt ended up doing the right thing. Did he have difficult moral choices to make? Yeah, you better believe it. And so are there some people who will never forgive him? Yes. But I think we'd be in a much worse world today if the United States had not entered World War II when we did, and as a united country. Because we saw what happens with Vietnam when you enter a war and you're not a united country. And you're told lies about that war all throughout the thing. And you're not only not united, but you're becoming more and more torn apart by the thing. You can see what a bad result can occur if you're fighting a war and you're not a united country. So it's my take on the story, and my main take is to make sure that you, the audience, understands the way Roosevelt was thinking and what his motivations were and how it really went down. And the reason I thought that was important is because so many mainstream books, and especially mainstream documentaries, have done such a terrible job with this story. So the recent 3-part documentary on FDR on the History Channel, it was part documentary, part docudrama, was okay if you took several steps back and looked at the forest and not at the trees, until you got to how we entered the war. And they did a terrible job in that regard. They did a terrible job. And Ken Burns did a terrible job on how we got into World War II. He did a terrible job. Great pictures, great photographs. But Ken Burns has always employed mainstream historians to support his work, who support institutional groupthink by mainstream historians and mainstream journalists. The only documentary that came close to telling the truth about this story was the PBS documentary about FDR decades ago. It was just called FDR. And David Grubin was the writer and the producer. And he did talk truthfully about the secret promises Roosevelt made at the Argentia conference. He did speak truthfully about that. He did not know about the decrypt. He didn't know about the British decrypt I provide in the book, where Hitler says, if Japan and America fight for any reason, I'm declaring war on the United States. He didn't know about that. So that's the other of the 2 big dots that I connect in this story. So I guess those are my concluding remarks. There are details in the book that we couldn't cover in this venue, but I want to thank Dr. Corsi for giving me the time to cover this in the detail that I did. If you want more detail, read the book or read the earlier 2-volume book, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. But I prefer this latest version, the McCollum Memorandum. I think it's more readable, and I do think it's great material for a docudrama or a movie. There are a lot of dramatic scenes in there, pulled right out of the speeches and the diaries of the people alive at the time, that would provide plenty of grist for a film. So thank you again, Jerome, and I'm sure you would like to weigh in on this matter at this time.
First of all, Doug, I want to tell you, you've done a magnificent job. I couldn't have, you exceeded my wildest expectations of what you could cover. This is the book. And Doug followed it. You followed it, Doug. I was reading the book along with you as you did the presentation. And everything you covered is in this book, and a great deal more that couldn't possibly be covered in the time we had. I mean, this is a definitive work.
Thank you.
A very important subject. And I consider it to be, I'm glad you wrote it. Your first 2 volumes were excellent, but this one really ties it all together. Your first 2 volumes gave the data, but this book has analysis and has your thoughts about it. And I want to ask 1 or 2 questions, but I want everybody to see this. The reason it's a reason it's so important to me, and you're so important to me, is you've done both Pearl Harbor and, the yeoman's work on JFK and the assassination. And the moral questions are, it's a very difficult moral question, because if we had allowed Nazi Germany to win in World War II, and all kinds of horrors would have occurred. I mean, they were slaughtering Jews. They were coming into Russia, slaughtering everybody. This was a insane totalitarian ideology that could not have been more destructive at the time. If Hitler had not attacked the Jews and had the German Jewish scientists work for him, he might have had an atomic bomb, and there's no doubt in my mind he'd have used it. But the question is that the problem is, if you begin to allow government to lie, in other words, say, okay, for a moral purpose, for a good purpose, government can lie. Well, one of the key aspects of your work on JFK was that the government did lie. And I wanted to point out to you a paragraph. This is your volume 5 of this book, which is extremely important. And, on page, let's see, which one was it? Page, I have to find it myself. It's hard to talk and find the page. You have a discussion here where Lyndon Johnson, after he was president, told his psychiatrist that he, in fact, was involved in giving the order to kill Jack Kennedy. And you document it well enough to say that, okay, there's some good reason to believe that he was involved. And of course, Kennedy, you also do a very good job of showing how the Secret Service opposed Kennedy's lifestyle, his libertine ways, how the military-industrial complex was never recovered from his working with Khrushchev, the speech he gave at American University, the reaching out he did to Khrushchev to end the Cuban Missile Crisis, his finally saying we don't need to have war with Russia, we need to live in this world together, and how our military did not want that. And now you have the U.S. government lying, involved, complicit in the assassination. Your work demonstrates that. I'm doing more on that right now. But did FDR set the precedent again for government lying, thinking it has a higher purpose? And that principle is a very dangerous principle. We see it today. You've got the FBI in political investigations when obviously Joe Biden's corruption and other issues need to be examined. If the FBI say, well, we are for a higher standard of American justice, and we do not think that, we need to go after Joe Biden, we need to go after the Trump supporters. And we've always had a principle in this country of not using our Department of Justice for partisan political purposes. So my question really is, your thoughts on, did the precedent that the FDR set and the subsequent application of that principle as we got into the Cold War, it has tremendous implications for evil if it's not properly used. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say two things about my work with FDR in Pearl Harbor and the Kennedy assassination. And that is that it's important that we understand today what really happened. Because if you don't understand today what really happened with those two events, and if the nation is not made to understand it and doesn't come to understand it, then we're in danger of similar things happening in the future. For example, JFK had a fraudulent autopsy from start to finish. The whole thing was a fraud. It was fraudulent. That's what my whole book is about. And I agree with John Newman, Professor John Newman, a former Army intelligence officer, who today believes that it's too simplistic to say the CIA killed Kennedy, or as some people have, that LBJ killed Kennedy. He believes the Pentagon was actually at the galactic center of the JFK coup, and that the CIA were willing handmaidens. And I would add to that by saying that I certainly think Lyndon Johnson had foreknowledge. All of his behavior shows that. He had foreknowledge, and it certainly didn't make him unhappy at all. So I think what I've been trying to do is avoid an improper whitewashing of major historical events like how we entered World War II for real and how this president was assassinated. And the same thing goes for his brother, too, another complete cover-up. But we have to beware in this country of institutional groupthink, where the only things that are acceptable for discussion in history texts or on documentaries are mainstream historical consensus. That's a very dangerous thing. So that's what I'm trying to do, is break up the false consensus about how the U.S. entered World War II by laying out the facts. And I've tried in the past, and I know you're working on another book now with Dr. Mantic. I've tried to prove that the entire JFK autopsy was a fraud, and that you don't have a fraudulent autopsy if a lone nut killed the president. The only reason to have a fraudulent autopsy is if you're covering up a coup. And then the important thing is not how many gunmen there were and where they were all standing, but the fact that is the real question is who hired them and why. So I guess without me getting into today's events, is something I don't desire to do today, but I do think that the false simplification of the mainstream explanations of how we entered World War II and both Kennedy assassination, those false explanations provided to the public are demeaning, insulting, and they're dangerous. And I will go to my grave until I'm 6 feet under the grass, doing all I can to tell the truth about those events, because I think telling the truth is important, and it's the way to minimize the same kinds of mistakes from happening today. That's all.
I think that's, first of all, your work on JFK will be very important, and it's extremely important, the work we're doing with David Mantic, Dr. Mantic, and your analysis of the autopsy and of the medical evidence is indispensable to the work we're putting together now. But I think the fundamental thing to me that has been so impressive is that your commitment to the truth. In other words, we've got to start with the truth. It may not be what we want. It may not be what we like to hear. It may not be how we agree politically.
Right.
But the truth has got to be known. And it's
to the truth. That's right. People have asked me, why did you write that 5-volume book about your ARRB memoir? Why did you write 2 different books about FDR and Pearl Harbor? The answer is simple. It's because I don't like being lied to. I really don't like it. To the innermost fiber of my being, I hate being lied to. And there are too many people who get involved in all these mainstream documentaries and simplistic mainstream accounts in books that they think the American people can't handle the truth. And so they call themselves institutionalists. And they say things like, well, I'm not going to support that conspiracy theory because it's damaging to our institutions, and I think we need to support our institutions. My answer to that is, if your institutions are built on lies, then they're built on a foundation of sand that cannot stand. And so we had lies told to us about 3 major assassinations in the 1960s, and look at the results today. Too many people don't believe anything the government says, no matter what it's about. It's because they realized at some inner level that we were lied to about very important events in the 1960s. And that has seeped into the public consciousness. And so, yeah, I just don't like being lied to. I'm a truth teller. And I believe that in the long run, more good will come out of telling the truth than in continuing to tell people fairy tales that aren't true. Well, so I want to thank you again, Jerome.
Well, especially, I mean, the fact is, you could have, look, you didn't do this for money.
No.
You didn't do this for fame.
No.
You didn't do it. You knew it was going to be difficult. You were dogged in sourcing everything you say. Everything is so well sourced. You've done enormous. In the ARRB, you sought people out, you interviewed them, you worked with Jeremy Gunn, the attorney, you prepped things, you were dogged in getting down to the facts, you looked at all the different angles of things to decide, and you do it here too with the Pearl Harbor. You get to the intercepts, and you're taking all these historical works which have told us now since Pearl Harbor, this 1941, and we're now at 2023, have told us that the Japanese maintained radio silence. They've told us lie after lie after lie, because the hard truth, which is let it fall where it may, Roosevelt let the men and women who died at Pearl Harbor die and he ruined Admiral Kimmel's career, other careers. He could have given Leighton and Rochefort the JN-25 intercepts that he had. Didn't want to prepare them. And those are issues which are first of all, they're true. We have to start there. And we have to realize that we always need to get to the truth in order to be able to evaluate these policies. And you can tell any number of instances, and I won't get into the modern current politics, but you can think of a dozen instances where we've gotten into wars on the basis of premises that are not true. And again, I don't care who the politician is or how brilliant they think they are, how able they are. FDR was right, and the case was compelling that Nazi Germany had to be stopped. But yet the president, and there was not really an alternative. We would not have gotten into the war. He tried everything. You were brilliant in showing how, these ship attacks, 3 ships, they finally gave up. And that's why I like this book so much, because you do take on the moral questions and you struggle with them. And I don't think these are easy questions, but I think
they're not, Jerome. And it's a good way for us to have ended our discussion today. This book, thank you so much for holding it up.
I want people to buy it and read it.
Yeah, it's the best book about FDR and Pearl Harbor and how we really entered the war that you've never heard of.
And this book, you beat what you top Stinnett. What he did was excellent, but you took it to another level.
I agree. What he did was excellent, and it was groundbreaking. And for those of you who want to read the entire McCollum Memorandum, the whole thing, he published it in facsimile. So you can read his appendix and read every single word in it, which is wonderful. And what I did was I quoted the final 3 or 4 paragraphs in the document. But I also tried to bring McCollum to life for you and, explain to you who he was, and the fact that he became friends with Johan Raneft, the Dutch naval attaché, who enters the end of our story. So there are so many pages of books, Jerome, on the Pearl Harbor attack. There are too many books for sale. There's so many pages of books on Amazon. I think this book is on page 67 of 70 book pages.
Well,
that's the problem. So they
needs to be on page 1.
List things based on how many copies they've sold already. So if people want to change that, they can go and just order this on your recommendation, which I very much appreciate. If they like what they've heard today and they want to read more about it and read the details, they can do that with the book. So I would encourage people to do that. You're not going to read this book in 1 or 2 days. It's going to take a week or 2, but I think it will captivate you.
And you're going to read it more than once. You're going to read it more than once because it's not. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, and you've got to take time to let that absorb and to, reflect on what you just learned. But Roosevelt
had to slow down his advisors many times. He had many advisors who wanted him to declare war on Germany, and he kept saying no. American people aren't ready for that. So he had to tell Secretary of War Stimson, Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, Secretary of the Navy Knox, and others, no. in fact, we're not even going to convoy yet. He knew that, he had lost the American people twice. And he says, I can't do what Woodrow Wilson did and lose the American people. Because if I do, I'll turn around and there'll be nobody following me. So Woodrow Wilson lost the American people over the League of Nations, didn't bring them along with that. Roosevelt lost the people on the court packing scheme in 1937. He knew he couldn't do that again. And a humorous aspect, he also lost them again when he tried to change the date of Thanksgiving in 1939. Tried to move it up a week to boost Christmas sales, and that backfired on him too. So he knew he couldn't get way out in front of American opinion, so he was always trying to mold it, and eventually he couldn't mold it anymore. He needed an act of violence to mold American opinion, and that's the moral dilemma, and that's for something for each reader to evaluate for himself or herself. But as you say, I'm glad you recognize that, we really didn't have a choice, but eventually to get into that war. And one of the things that Harold Ickes told Roosevelt was, if we don't get into this war soon, when we do, it'll be too late and we'll not have a friend anywhere if we sit it out too long. And that was what finally persuaded Roosevelt to do the oil embargo on Japan. Is I can't wait around anymore.
Well, if Japan had attacked Hitler, had attacked Stalin, if they had attacked Stalin, Hitler had a much better chance of taking Moscow.
That's
Stalin.
right. That's right.
We couldn't.
It wasn't just the bad weather, which there was. It wasn't just the fact that his supply lines were too long, which they were, but it was the fact that Stalin brought in 1.5 million more troops, which he didn't need in Siberia because the Japanese were forced not to attack in Siberia. Forced by Roosevelt, by the embargo. So,
Stalin used them. He used those troops ruthlessly. He threw them into battle, and the resources that Hitler wasted in fighting Stalin was fundamental in our ability. I mean, what would a Normandy invasion been had Hitler and Stalin worked together, or had, if Japan had attacked Russia, and Russia had to fight a two-front war. Hitler defeats Russia. Well, now we have no way for Hitler to be in a two-front war.
That's right. And Hitler would then eventually have invaded Great Britain.
Oh, certainly.
Overpowered them. It might have taken him another year to get ready for it, but that was already in his plans. And so without Great Britain there to serve as a bombing platform for the American and British bombers, and without Great Britain there to serve as a launching platform for the Normandy invasion, there would have been no defeat of Germany in the war.
At the same time, it's important now that we go back and get the truth. And it's important that we stay to the standard of getting the truth. It's important that we have reporters or historians that are courageous enough not to worry about their institutional position, to want to have a emeritus position at some prestigious university, which you don't have, which I don't have. And I couldn't care less.
Me too. I didn't have to worry about that. So I didn't have to worry about not getting emeritus or not getting tenure at Podunk University. I was just able to tell it like it is as I see it. And
what you worried about was, I've got to go interview this guy. I've got to get this information. I've got to dig this out. You were dogged in doing that. And that's what I admire so much.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Corsi, for your support, and especially for the time you've given me on this subject. I can't thank you enough. Thanks a lot.